Good afternoon and good evening, everyone, depending on what time zone you're in. And welcome to our Ask an Archaeologist panel, part 2. This is a continuation of a panel that we had earlier in the Tadaima virtual pilgrimage. And I'm here with a whole new host of archaeologists and really fantastic scholars who have worked on a range of subjects. We have Bill Belcher, who is a professor at University of Nebraska, Renae Campbell, a PhD student at University of Idaho and a research associate with the University of Idaho's Asian American Comparative Collection, Patricia Chirinos Ogata, who's a PhD candidate in archaeology at UC Santa Barbara, and Bob Muckle, who's an archaeologist based out of Capilano University in North Vancouver. And I'm Koji Lau-Ozawa, and I'm a PhD candidate at Stanford University. And I'm just so excited to be here with such a great group of scholars, all working on various parts of Japanese diaspora archaeology. I'm really excited to hear them introduce themselves and their own work. So I'll turn the table over first to Bill, if you can give us a little background on yourself and your research.
Sure. As Koji said, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and I've been here just coming on a year now. And so, but I spent 4.5 years at the University of Hawaii, West Oahu, and during that time, I ran an annual field school between 2016 to 2019 at the Honouliuli National Historic Site, which is the site of a Japanese internment or incarceration camp, as well as a large POW camp. And so it's a little bit unusual with some of the other incarceration sites in the mainland US because it was run by the military and it was under different sort of directives based on the economy of the island, but we can talk about that a little later. So great, it's great to be here, thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Next up, Renae.
All right, well, thanks for the introduction. My name is Renae Campbell, and as Koji said, I'm a historical archaeologist, a PhD student at the University of Idaho. And congrats to the 2 PhD candidates in the room. Hopefully I'll be that soon. But I'm also a research associate at the Asian American Comparative Collection. And just briefly, for folks who don't know what that is, it's a pretty amazing resource. That's actually what brought me here to Idaho in the first place. It's a nonprofit research facility that was founded by Dr. Priscilla Wegers in the 1980s, and it's essentially a clearinghouse of artifacts, comparative objects, documents, and other resources related to Asian American heritage in the West, with a specific focus on Asian American archaeology. And then I guess most pertinent to this conversation here, one of the things that I study is the archaeology of pre-World War II Japanese and Japanese American communities in the West. So my master's research focused on archaeological collections from 3 sites along the West Coast, one in California, one in Oregon, and one in Washington. And I look specifically at Japanese ceramic collections from those 3 sites. What brought me to Japanese ceramics in particular is that that's sort of a material class that, unlike, say, Euro-American ceramics or Chinese ceramics, hasn't really received the type of robust attention from archaeologists that other material classes have. So that was kind of the research question that brought me there. And Japanese ceramics are something that are found very commonly at Japanese diaspora sites throughout the West Coast, both pre-war and during the war period. So something that has relevance to hopefully a lot of other scholars doing similar work. And to that end, I also created and now maintain the Historical Japanese Ceramic Comparative Collection, which is kind kind of what it sounds like. It's an online resource for archaeologists and other researchers looking at historical Japanese ceramics and how to identify and describe them archaeologically.
Thank you, Renae. Patricia, if you can introduce yourself next.
Thank you, Koji, and thank you actually for organizing this wonderful event. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Patricia Chirinos Ogata, a Peruvian Nikkei archaeologist, currently, as Koji said, wrapping up my PhD in anthropology at UCSB. And when I started doing archaeology, and it's part of what I still do today, I was focused on prehistoric, what you can call pre-Columbian archaeology, and specifically the WWII Empire, which is the larger imperial experiment before the better-known Inca here in Peru. And in particular, I was looking at issues of cultural encounters, the connections between local and foreign populations. But what happened, and as it usually happens, was that while I was writing my dissertation on the topic and becoming more and more interested in my own family history, I found that not much really had been done in terms of the archaeology of the Japanese immigration to Peru. So, and I found that this ideas about cultural encounters, entanglements, and formation of new identities, or basically what happens when two different groups of people started living together, could be adapted and applied to this case. So with that in mind, I became a member of this research group called the Japanese Presence in Peru in the 17th to the 20th centuries at the Instituto Ribaguero here in Lima. And I personally decided to focus on the archaeology of the haciendas, the agricultural estates where the Issei first worked when arrived to the country. Many of these haciendas were still functioning until a bit after the agrarian reform of 1969, and we have been collecting data on them for a while now. We decided to focus on these haciendas because they were the scenarios of these first interactions, and because the connections made here, either among Issei or between Issei and Peruvians, and later moved to larger cities, play a significant role on the formation of what we now call the Nikkei community. So we were planning to do some more detailed mapping and surveying this year, but of course the plans have been delayed due to this global pandemic. So in the meantime, we are gathering more textual and photographic data, and we hope to be able to continue with this project in the short term.
Thank you, Patricia. And I'll just ask if everybody who's not speaking can mute themselves while we're going on. I think one of the commenters said there might be some feedback. Bob, if you can give us an introduction of yourself and the work you're doing up in Canada.
Okay, thanks, Koji. I've been doing archaeology virtually all my adult life, which is a long time. The focus on the Nikkei sites has been like a second career for me. I started off my career with my own consulting company, working primarily for indigenous populations in Canada. I've also worked in Egypt and parts of the US, but mostly it's been British Columbia. I started working at Capilano University, which is a small university on the outskirts of Vancouver, 30 years ago. And 20 years ago, I got a little bit restless. I was missing all the field work. So for the year 2000, I started a small local archaeology field school with the agreement of the university. It would be 1 year only, and that was 20 years ago, but it just took off from there. I enjoyed it so much, taking my students into it was a local valley, no expectation of finding anything related to Japanese whatsoever. It's a valley that's had very restricted access for the last 100 years. I was planning on finding some early Euro-Canadian settlements or houses and things like that, but I just started coming across unexpectedly Japanese sites, and we've discovered and excavated 3 different sites from the early 1900s. One site I've only done 1 field season at, and I really haven't done any analysis yet on it, but it seems to be more of a mixed camp. Haven't sorted out the Euro-Canadian from the Japanese yet. But there's two other sites where I've done extensive work on. One was a Japanese logging camp dating to about 1920, which was occupied for just a couple of years, and then it was very clearly deliberately abandoned. No buildings stand anymore, but we were able to do a few years of excavation, a few field seasons of excavation, and pretty well established that it was a short-term logging camp. Entirely of Japanese. And then a more interesting site, only a few miles away, that we came across with no idea that we'd find anything Japanese there. I thought it was just another logging camp, but as soon as we excavated, we started finding Japanese artifacts. And again, there was no standing visible structures, but what I've been able to piece together over several field seasons, that this was started off as a Japanese logging camp, probably around 1918 or 1919, used for a couple of years. And then when logging ceased in the valley, for the whole valley just stopped logging, I strongly believe that a group of Japanese continued to live at this logging camp for another 20 years until World War II internment. Many people aren't aware that Canada went through the same process of internment as in the US, and in early 1942, all people of Japanese descent were removed from the coastal region. And I have significant evidence that this is what happened. It's a very unusual layout of a site. It was clearly laid out in a typical Japanese village fashion almost. We can find evidence of a bathhouse, and we can find a garden, and several, more than a dozen small houses where a logger would have lived with his family. And all the evidence suggests that in 1942, they just essentially packed what they could carry and closed the door behind them and walked away. So we find all these clusters of household items with toothbrushes and toothpaste and shoes and pieces of clothing, as well as dishes and medicine bottles. So it's pretty interesting. So it's this fairly remote village site, but only about an hour to an hour and a half walking distance to where the men could have maintained jobs in local lumber mills in the city of North Vancouver. So that's sort of taken over my life in recent years. I still got thousands of artifacts, and I'm in the process now of still analyzing them. The last field season was last year in 2019. And I'm working quite closely with the Nikkei National Museum. And just two or 3 weeks ago, I sent them over. I delivered, several dozen artifacts that they had asked for. So I've been working quite closely with the Nikkei National Museum folks, but not as much as I would have liked to. Again, this was supposed to be a one field season only project. And here now I am in year 20. So, thank you.
Wow, 20 years.
20,
I suppose I should, I sort of forgot, I should introduce myself and what I work on as well. So I'm a PhD candidate at Stanford, and I've been working for the last 6 years now with the Gila River Indian Community's Cultural Resource Management Program to document, record, and study the remains of the Gila River incarceration camp in southern Arizona, and got started on this project mostly because of an interest, sort of like Patricia, and my own history. As I went into grad school, I had an idea of studying something, and then it occurred to me that studying my own history might be something that is worth looking at, which I think is an option a lot of us who come to this field find out later on in our careers. And so my grandparents had been incarcerated at Gila River, and I'd always been aware of camp and sort of the camp history, and was really fortunate to have synced up with the Gila River Indian community to develop this archaeological project. And that's what I've been working on for the last 6 years now, since 2014. Not quite 20, but ask me in 14 years, and hopefully I'll be where Bob is today. I'm seeing Bill is having some technical difficulties, so hopefully he'll be able to join us with maybe just audio. Bill, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I
Excellent.
can hear you.
Okay.
Great. We just finished our introductions, so I just want to put it out to all of our viewers that this is an Ask an Archaeologist panel, so it's a live Q&A. in the comments section. Please type in any questions you might have over the next hour, and we'll try to answer all of them as best we can. So don't be shy, add in your questions, but I'll get us started out first with just a really basic question for those who aren't familiar, and anybody can feel free to answer this. What exactly does archaeology tell us about Japanese migrant history in the United States and Canada and Hawaii and Peru that we aren't getting from the archival record? What's archaeology telling us that's sort of different?
Anybody want to go first?
Well, Bill, since you started, why don't you go first?
Okay, well, the situation in Hawaii was very different with the incarceration because very few of Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans were incarcerated in the camps because it was tied into the economics of the sugarcane plantation. So there's a lot of other issues involved that I'm interested in looking at, is colonialism and the changing environment of Oahu because of the rerouting of water and how that dealt with water rights of the Native Hawaiians. And so these are some of the other issues that one of my colleagues and I, David Engelman, will be looking at with some of the data that we collected over the last 4 years. But it's also because it was just a really different situation because we've got a vast, really rich record that's collected by the Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaii of interviews and watercolors and artifacts that were collected by the families. And so what we're trying to do is go in and then do the archaeological aspect of it and see what's left. Jeff Burton and Mary Farrell are the ones who first started doing this. And then I sort of took over the field school in 2016. And it's just been instrumental in trying to understand but it's the central portion of the camp is where about 320 to 350 incarcerees were held. But the rest of it was military and POWs. And so it's a really different dynamic that was going on within that. And so we've got lots of really nice architectural remains of architecture for the POWs but it's really nice in the center part dealing with the incarcerees. And it fills out the gap with some of the things that we're finding that you can actually see in some of the watercolors and things like that. It's beautiful.
Wow, that's really interesting looking at those watercolors and sort of being able to compare and look at the same landscape through those two really different mediums. That's really interesting. And Bob, if I'm remembering correctly about your site, there aren't so many archival records. Is that right? That
right.
You've been able to find?
One of the big contributions that I can make in archaeology is that there's virtually no archival records. These camps where I'm excavating are undocumented. I can piece together things, but by and large, there's very little known about the logging industry by the Nikkei. I mean, we know there's been quite a bit of scholarship on the Nikkei in the lumber mills, but in the camps, there's been relatively little. So I can add a lot to that. But one of the other things, when you pose the question, Koji, is one of the things something that we can bring that archival research doesn't, is we can provide a different kind of, for lack of better words, like a feeling. I've been lucky that I've been able to have a lot of Nikkei people, particularly elderly Nikkei people, up to the site where we are. It's quite difficult to get to, but I've been able to get them on site quite a bit. And I sort of lay out for them what I'm thinking is going on and show them where the gardens are and where the bathhouse is. And they seem to just like really enjoy that. It's like more of a tangible idea or a feeling that they get of living there, and they all just imagine what life was like. And historians that focus on the Japanese Canadians have told me the same thing. They just like love coming up because it's more than a picture. It's like you're standing where they're standing. You're standing right there. You're right where the bathhouse is. They love all that. So it's a different kind of thing than looking at photographs or looking at documents. Also, we can get some more specifics. We have so many, pharmaceutical or medicine bottles, so we can what are the things that they were dealing with there, and we can see all the kinds of food they were eating and the kinds of beer they were drinking. So the things that historians don't usually put down, or people who are writing the memoirs don't think about putting down because they often think it's not interesting, But as many archaeologists know, like the real finds, for example, are in the latrines, right? It's like a bonanza when we find the latrine, where there's so much good stuff that comes out of there in terms of artifacts. So. And all the Nikkei people who come to the site, they're just overwhelmed, for example, with the ceramics, particularly. They always comment about the ceramics and how nice they are, what good condition they are, and things like that. And for the non-Nikkei people, they get overwhelmed with the bottles. So it's tangible things that we can bring to it. And as I say, I'm the only archaeologist I'm the only archaeologist currently working on Nikkei. I'm actually the only archaeologist in British Columbia that regularly focuses on anything less than 200 years old. But we're providing important information. There's one site I've worked at 2 years ago was placed on the register of important places in British Columbia, with the support of the Nikkei community, because they recognize that this is a good example of life pre-World War II. And the Nikkei tend to tell me often that they really appreciate it because they have so few records. My impression is that we don't have nearly the infrastructure for studying the past as there is in the U.S. in terms of the Nikkei presence. It's getting there, but it's not there yet. So every time I get Nikkei up to visit the site, or I go to the Nikkei Cultural Center to give a talk, I'm always thinking I'm going to learn something from them, but it's usually the reverse. They're just asking me all these questions, and they're so interested. So.
Thank you, Bob. That's really interesting, especially thinking about those differences between the United States and Canada and sort of the infrastructure of archaeology. And to that end, Patricia, I know that you and the work that you're doing down in Peru is sort of, I think, a really new approach to the Japanese-Peruvian history, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, and actually building upon what Bob said, definitely the majority of archaeological projects here in Peru are focused on the pre-Hispanic or pre-Columbian part of our history. And so the number of archaeological projects focused on the most recent past is almost non-existent. And particularly about the Japanese immigration, the Japanese diaspora, and even the Asian diaspora in general is basically a new field. Is being built as we speak, and one particular aspect that got me into it was, well, of course, family history, but also like the idea of there are many historical accounts of the haciendas, lots of documents about them, lots of archival information, but none of them actually describe, for example, what objects did the immigrants bring with them. So the idea through this archaeological project that we're planning is to get a glimpse at, okay, what objects did they bring with them, and if you this idea of migration, like if you have to pack the essentials to go to a country that you don't know much about, what do you bring? It's very different that it was very different back then that it is now. Well, with lots of information available online and stuff, if you have to pack the essentials, what do you carry? What kinds of things are you carrying to this different country? And so we're aiming at getting a glimpse at that.
That's really interesting. And Renae, I think your examination of ceramics maybe can speak to some of the ways in which you're finding ceramics that are manufactured in the US and ones that are manufactured for maybe domestic consumption in Japan. Do you see a large portion of the story that's being told through the ceramics that we haven't heard yet through the historical record?
Yeah, I think it's a part that doesn't often appear in the historical record, and particularly, kind of again to echo what Bob said, but in my experience of studying what are primarily like first generation Japanese immigrant communities, there aren't a lot of historical documents that really relate to their daily life experience. There are a lot of documents related to, if they're in a labor community, maybe the mill that is hiring the laborers, and to the management structure and things like that. But in terms of like describing daily life and something as tangible as eating meals and purchasing ceramics, that kind of gives a different perspective on sort of the broad brushstrokes of history. You get to see these sort of intimate details, and the fact that you find these Japanese ceramics at all those sites means that it obviously is a critical component of the experience of these communities. So I think there's also a lot of research that should continue to be done on the networks that supplied the ceramics to different communities. And I think that one of the really interesting things that we find is Japanese diaspora communities aren't just consuming Japanese ceramics. There's also Euro-American ceramics and sometimes Chinese ceramics, but there's a really wide variety of Japanese ceramics. So they are obviously very well supplied with a diversity of vessels that are coming from Japan. And some of those networks we know about, and some of those networks we don't know about. So that's, I think, another interesting aspect that it exposes is sort of the networks of people and places that cross the Pacific and back, and how those goods get to the different communities.
Yeah, that circulation of goods is, I think, a really interesting aspect that archaeology is really well attuned to with our sort of material focus. And Patricia, in the work you've done on the haciendas, have you seen a lot of similar sorts of ceramic patterns as Renae's describing that are popping up in the US, of these mixed assemblages? Patricia, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we haven't seen that much in terms of like artifacts yet. We are still at the preliminary stage, but we're actually looking forward to do that, because I saw Renae's talk I think a few weeks ago, showing the work that she has done so far, and I was like overwhelmed by the amount of information you guys have, and I was like, we need to catch up in terms of the amount of studies of like artifacts, and specifically pottery, to be able to exchange information at that level. And we need to catch up fast. I'm trying to encourage as many colleagues as possible to devote time to this particular time period and particular processes. What we have found is still small collections of objects in a couple of museums. There are 2 museums that are devoted to the Japanese immigration, and they are in the process of, the main one here in the district where I live, the 2 of them are in Lima, but one is like closest to my house than the other. And the main one, the oldest one, has a larger collection of artifacts, but they are still in the process of cataloging everything and putting that information online, so it can be easily accessed by the public. But because we still need people, as you guys obviously know, it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of people, it takes a lot of time, and so we're still not there yet. Hopefully, in a couple of years, we can have something more elaborate about that. But in the meantime, we're trying to convince as many colleagues as possible to go that way.
That's quite a challenge. And I think, Bob, you were alluding a little bit to a similar challenge in Canada, where I think you said you were the only person who's been working on historical archaeology in British Columbia. Is that
anyone who does it on a regular basis? Yeah,
on a regular basis?
Yeah, and, yeah. We're all focused on Indigenous archaeology up here. So on occasion, others will, contact me and say, Bob, what is this? What is this? Just as they're digging to get through the deeper stuff. But also very fortunate that, Douglas Ross did his PhD locally, and he's a phenomenal job. And so that's my go-to comparative sources is Doug Ross's dissertations and the several articles that he wrote. He pretty much set the standard. So it makes my job a lot easier, right? Just for comparative analysis.
Mm-hmm.
That's quite a bit easier.
So I'm interested for all of these projects, both the ones that have like a large sort of archaeological infrastructure already in place and the ones like Bob and Patricia you're talking about that don't yet. I'm guessing community engagement's a really important part of the work you all do. And so if you can just take a moment to speak to that and sort of how community outreach is working on your sites and some things that you found from these processes of engagement that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise. I think I can't support enough how much community engagement is important to the process of archaeology. People think it's just people digging, but I think that there's a lot archaeologists learn from the community as well.
Yeah, I've done it. Go ahead.
Sorry. I was going to say that, well, here, community participation and engagement could happen or would happen in two different levels. First is the Nikkei community in general. And I think there's a lot of interest, especially in the last decade or so, in terms of cultural activities and reconstructing the past of the origins, the formation of the Nikkei community, sort of in to the general audience, but also the Nikkei community in particular. So every single talk about this topic gets a crowded room, and so that's one particular group of people that we are aiming to connect with. But also there's another level of that, which is the people living around the haciendas, and in those cases, they usually, the haciendas themselves are divided in like two main groups: the ones that are still functioning in some sort of way, and the ones that have been left abandoned. So depending on that, the connection between the hacienda itself and the people living around them is going to be different. If it's like a touristic spot or not, or something that works, that is integrated in the lives of the community. And so that would be like a second group of people that we need to connect with. And in both cases, the main group of people that still have pieces of these past to be reconstructed are these two groups. And so we hope, well, no, it's not that much of a hope. It's like it's an obligation. There's no other way to do this work than to involve these two parts of the community.
In my project, I've done approximately 100 presentations, but remember, I've been at this for 20 years, so that's only an average of about 5 a year. So I've always been keen on public outreach on various levels. One is just the local community, where I thought it would all be focused with your Canadian stuff. So I started off there before I started finding the Nikkei remains. But so I've always had a large focus on the local community, and I've had probably about half of the field seasons we've had public archaeology days, which when I had near the end of a field season, when I feel comfortable with my students, they can supervise themselves, usually in about week 7 or week 8 of the field school. I'll ask for volunteers, and we'll spend a day and have anybody who really wants to, up to a maximum of 50 people on site, and usually give them part of the site where it's not going to be a significant part of the site anyways. So they get a lot of interest out of that. I've had, as I mentioned earlier, I've had a few occasions where I've had special tours for the Nikkei community to come out. I've never really learned that much myself from those, but except for that sense of satisfaction and the enjoyment I see the Nikkei people having. I've given presentations at the Nikkei Center on multiple occasions, and I found that really quite valuable. One of my favorite, sometimes people ask an archaeologist, what's your favorite artifact? And I usually will tell them it's like what I thought was like a diaper pin. You know, it was like a diaper pin about this big, I thought. And at that time, it was fairly early in my work. I was thinking, well, okay, I'm looking for evidence of children. You know, maybe it's this diaper pin. And so I took it to one of my talks at the Nikkei Cultural Center, and I asked, there was probably about 75 or 80 Nikkei in the audience, mostly elderly, and I asked if anybody knew what this was, and I said, I'm thinking it might be evidence of children. And the unanimous view, the consensus opinion was that was not a diaper pin, that was a women's shawl pin. And, you know, and they told me, even though I didn't ask, it was very valuable to me because two of the things that I was looking for besides evidence of children, I was looking for evidence of women, and I was looking for evidence of a winter occupation. Because if it was a winter occupation, that would tell me that it was a permanent settlement, not a logging camp, that it had already transitioned. Because when it was logging in this area, they'd never logged in the winter, they'd leave. So if I could find evidence of a winter occupation, that further supported my hypothesis that people continue to live there in a kind of secret. So I mean that's kind of was a fabulous thing for me to get that consensus opinion. But I write a lot. Well, I used to write multiple articles for the local Nikkei bulletin or newsletter. I write quite a bit for the local archaeology community as well, because although I'm the only historic archaeologist, all the other archaeologists are keenly interested in what I do. And I think I've had about 60 professional archaeologists out to the site just because they're interested in seeing what I'm doing. And from that, I learn a lot. People suggesting things to me, which I find quite valuable. But I get a lot of satisfaction from the public outreach. I just wish in retrospect that I had involved the Nikkei community earlier on. You know, so I work as much, and they seem to appreciate my work, and we have a good working relationship. I just wish I started earlier. So there's that.
Yeah, I think it's always different when you're building it in from the ground up than sort of adding it together ad hoc as you go along.
Yeah.
And Bill, what's the landscape like in both your field school work at Honolulu and the work you're doing in Hawaii?
Well, it's like Bob. It's like at the time I was really the only professional historical archaeologist on Oahu, and that was actually why one of my job was created at the University of Hawaii, West Oahu, so it didn't conflict with other archaeological projects going on the island. And there was a focus. The campus is considered to be the indigenous and sort of minority campus on the west side of the island, and so we try to serve that population. And so we just had so at the time of the camp's occupation, there was about 40% of the population of Hawaii was Japanese or Japanese American. And right now it's about 17%. But there's a large percentage of Japanese, Filipino descent, as well as indigenous students at our campus. And so this was really an unknown part of the history of the island that really people didn't really even remember where the site was until the late 90s. And it was sort of rediscovered through some archival work. And people knew there was something out there, but it was a military occupation. It was hidden inside a valley you can't really see anything there unless you go up on top of the ridge. You could see Honolulu. But it's the Japanese Cultural Center are the people that really focused on this. And so we've worked very closely with them. And so it's been wonderful for me. And now we're getting into a point where most of the archaeology is done, except on the extreme northern and southern ends of the property. And I want to mention also, because it's a National Historic Site, it's owned by the American people, but administered by the Department of the Interior and the National Park Service. And so, but the southern and northern ends of it were these massive POW areas where there were over 4,000 people imprisoned. And so that's an area that I'd like to focus on in the future, if allowed, but I have other duties now that I'm in Nebraska. But it's just working with the Japanese Cultural Center. The students really loved working at the site because it's actually just right across the freeway from our campus. And so it was maybe a 15 to 20-minute drive, depending on the weather, because the roads were pretty muddy. And then we would interact when about once a month, the Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaii would bring tours down, but they got to use the paved road through, I guess it's called Bear now, not Monsanto land, because it's all agricultural farming around the site. But it was wonderful working with the Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaii, engaging with the students. And so we developed a program on democratic principles and social justice, that they could incorporate this into part of their education as undergraduates. So, and I've done lots of lectures. It's interesting that it seems like once I've left the campus and I'm now in Nebraska, people want to hear more about what's going on there. So I actually gave a Zoom talk to over 100 people through the Pacific Historic Parks, which is a volunteer branch of the National Park Service. And so it's been really well received. And Koji, you've been very nice in inviting me to participate in this forum. And I've got a couple of articles that are coming out. And so, but I'm trying to engage a lot of the students to help do that. And when I left, part of the grant got turned over, and they're actually gathering more information on this aspect of ethnography. What does this site mean to the students? What does it mean to the people that work there? And so, and that was something that we had tried to do, sort of a metadata kind of archaeology in the past, and now we're able to actually do that. So I'm pretty excited to see the results of that in the future.
Oh, that's really interesting. I think that that question of what does the past mean to the people who have connections to these sites, both directly and sort of tangentially, is really important and really fascinating.
It is. Thank you.
And we have a question from Sean B here, who asks, what kinds of technology are you using these days? What kind of technology do you use in your work? I know a lot of archaeology is trowels and shovels and screens, but there's also a lot of technological pieces to it too. Anybody want to go? This is open to the floor.
I'm really old school. When I made the agreement with my university that I'd run my archaeology field school, the condition was I wouldn't ask for any money. So I borrow and I play around with line items on the budget, but I'm about as old school as you can get. And I often tell my students that you will be the go-to people when you make a career in professional archaeology. When all the batteries run out, or there's no electricity, or the software isn't working, you'll be the go-to person because you know how to read a topographic map, and you know how to operate a compass, and and write with a pencil in a field notebook. But so I wish I could have more high tech, but I don't. We're just not set up for it.
Yeah, Bob, this is Bill. That's exactly how I teach my field school. It's very low tech, but at the same time, we use a lot of GIS collection and total stations and things like that. But the issue is that we have to walk down a very steep hill and then go back up it at the beginning and end of each day. That's about 3/4 of a mile long. And in fact, one of my evaluation comments said that I underplayed the physical physical aspects of it. And so some people were a little bit upset that we had to do this walk. And with walking downhill, obviously, is not a big deal. But at the end of the day, when everybody's tired and we have to walk uphill 3/4 of a mile, and it's pretty steep. So because we didn't have the agreement of access with Monsanto to use their paved roads.
And Bill, for those of our listeners and viewers who aren't familiar, can you just describe briefly what a total station is and what GIS is?
Yeah, we have basically a GPS collector that we use, and most people are familiar with that with their smartphones or what have you. But it's very similar, but it's a lot more sophisticated, and they're portable that we're using, and they have GIS software. So we record different types of information. We were recording where the fence lines were, where all the archaeological features were. And we had several different layers of features that were associated with the POW camp, the Army camp, the incarceration area, as well as the post-1950 use of the land as a ranch. And so we had several different layers that we were able to combine through a computer program so we can start looking at that. And so, and then a total station just allows us to do very quick and accurate measurements, the same thing like we would have with a transit. But I'm like Bob, I like using an old school transit and then just writing everything down like I used to when I was a grad student at the University of Maine, and plug it into a spreadsheet that does all the conversion for me into a grid and depth below datum. So, because if the students drop it in the water, I'm not saying that happened, and then we have to go back to old school stuff, we're prepared. So.
And Renae and Patricia, what about yourselves? What kind of technology do you usually employ in your work?
Yeah, I'm very old school as well. I mean, one of the things that is in vogue right now and that everybody's using, so we are kind of forced to use it, is the drone and using Google Earth images to get a better mapping. A good idea of the in the process of mapping these haciendas and these states. But other than that, I mean, if we have to use measuring tapes and compasses, we're ready for it.
And Renae, you were about to say?
Chime in. Also, we use a lot of GPS, the same type of GPS technology, total stations or Trumbull units, other things like that. And then lately, as I've been moving my collections into like lab work, it's been a lot of photo documentation and uploading things to the internet. So it's actually a lot more of these digital technologies than the fieldwork stuff.
Oh, interesting. I know at the work I've been doing with the Gila River community, we've been also using drones to produce sort of higher resolution maps. And then I feel very now self-conscious of myself as a millennial when you guys keep talking about your old school methodologies. And I'm like, oh, we're using drones to capture and make these maps. And another thing we've been experimenting with are portable X-ray fluorescence devices, PXRF, which basically gives a chemical signature of objects that you use to scan with them that we've been trying to use to trace the origins of some basalt artifacts that we find across the incarceration camp. So a lot of total station work, GPS, drones, XRF going on in our work at Gila. But we always do revert back to notepads and pencils and tape measures at the end of the day. That's still part of the process in archaeology. We haven't strayed too far down the digital route. I know a lot of archaeological projects are also using more tablets and digital technologies with 3D scanners. That seems to be a growing field in especially public presentation and interpretation parts of the projects. So I guess another question that I could put out to our panelists here are, have there been any findings yet that you've had that sort of have challenged the historical record, that not only what can archaeology tell us that historical records can't, but have there been sort of things that you found that have come into conflict with the historical record, or that have surprised you in some way that you weren't expecting?
One of the things that I have found is that working in this restricted forest for the last 100 years, before that there was some settlement in there, but not very much. But one of the things that struck me is that because I've been doing this for so long. When I first started 20 years ago, there was a lot of people that lived in the valley 100 years ago, like in their 80s. But I was able, they're all long since passed now. But I was able in the first few years to interview them quite a bit and transcribe my interviews with them. And they had no recollection of the Nikkei ever being in the valley. And that, even though I take them to the sites and they see for themselves, yes, they were here, but they were astounded that they weren't aware of them. So they were almost invisible in the valley, which I find remarkable. And it's like after the logging ceased in the 1920s, this community of Nikkei decided to stay there. And sometimes people ask me, like, why would they have done that? And I can only speculate, and the two things I tend to come up with was it was an area free from racism at that time, because in the Vancouver area, there was a lot of racism against Asian populations in the early 1900s. So it could have been freedom from the racism, but it could have also just been an economic thing. Here was the camp already set up. It had gardens, it had houses, whatever. But they kept to themselves. And they also say, well, it was in a fairly remote area of the forest, so if no one would have been going by that area, or if they did see it, they wouldn't have cared. But the fact is that there was Euro-Canadians living, in very close proximity to this village of probably 50 to 60 people, and nobody knew about it. And they were astounded. I just find that fascinating myself.
No, that is, I think, really fascinating. That such a large village seems to be in some way so secluded, even though it's in such close proximity to other people.
Mm-hmm.
Renae, I saw your hand move towards the mute button.
I know I have this awkward camera placement on my computer. I see my hands every time I touch my keyboard, so it's like I'm raising my hands. But yeah, I think that actually is a really good example of the ways that archaeology kind of shows things that aren't in the historical documents. So I know one of the sites that I worked on for my master's thesis was a family of Japanese truck farmers who were living outside of the city limits, and because they weren't citizens, they legally were barred from citizenship as first-generation Japanese immigrants. Their names aren't on any of the property documents, which is kind of the typical place you would go to as an archaeologist to find out who owned this place, who lived here, and so. Also, because of where the house was in a rural county and slightly off the road, census takers seem to have missed the house on several occasions. And so finding the ties to the individuals who live there can be much harder when they're populations that aren't citizens or aren't homeowners or landowners or things like that. And so I think in that particular case, like even finding that site was a surprise that there were, it's an area where there was a lot of early Japanese truck farming. And so it wasn't surprising in that sense, but in terms of challenging sort of the historical record that was out there, it was a surprising find.
Definitely, and I think that that aspect, I think both that Renae and you and Bob have been sort of alluding to is this way in which a lot of these histories have been either marginalized, excluded, or hidden by various structures, whether it's land ownership and citizenship that sort of masks the historical presence of these Japanese communities, or sort of racial exclusion and discrimination that's pushing people into these periphery zones. I know as well in my work at Gila River, I've been really surprised to find the number of people in sort of towns close to the site of the incarceration camp who have never heard of, people who have never heard of Japanese American incarceration, which is always frustrating, but also people who have heard of it and weren't aware that there was an incarceration camp so close to them. And so we see again and again a lot of this history being hidden. And I think one aspect that we've really been fortunate with these projects is starting to bring more of this history to light. Bill, did you want to add something? I saw your mute speaker come on and off for a second.
There. Okay. Yeah, one of the areas that, like I said, that we've been looking at is the northern area where Japanese and Okinawan POWs were held. And this is really an unknown part of it. And so one of the things that we were looking for one of the mess hall platforms, and it actually had been buried due to sedimentation in the valley. Most of the features and the concrete platforms and structures and the bath houses and things are above ground or just barely below, covered up with sediment. But this was about 60 to 80 centimeters below the surface. And so it just had to do with where it was located on the site, and material is washing in from the surrounding farm fields above it. But the mess halls were an area of, congregation, meetings, and things like that with the POWs. And it's just something that we don't really even know that much about. And so two of my colleagues, Joyce Chinin and then Suzanne Falgu, were going to try to scrape up some money to do more archival research focused on those POW areas to see what kinds of activities were going on. Suzanne's done some really interesting research on the composition of the POWs, because the military usually lumped the Okinawans with the Japanese military. And most of the Okinawans were labor conscripts. And then they were incarcerated or imprisoned there. But they also had a lot of relatives on Oahu. And so it was an interesting dynamic, and dealing with the guards and throwing things over the no man's zones between the incarcerees and the POWs. And so it's a very interesting social dynamic going on there that we would like to investigate more on looking at these POWs, because that platform is barely uncovered, and we'd like to uncover it more, but and see what's going on, and get a better picture of that from the archival record, which is virtually untapped. So.
Wow, that's really fascinating, those social connections, and that sort of the way in which those you were talking about, those Okinawan POWs that had familial and social ties to Okinawans in Hawaii, which I think is a story that permeates to the public even less than Japanese American internment at large or incarceration at large, is sort of the various different aspects of the Japanese experience, be it Okinawan or these other aspects, or Peruvian, for instance, which I think, again, a lot of our viewers may not be as familiar with. We have another question coming in here from Marcia Edwards, who's asking about funding. How are these projects being funded? If you all want to just take a second to talk about how do these projects come about? They don't come out of nowhere. I know Bob runs his out of the side of his desk and has asked his university for no money, but there is funding that comes from somewhere. So,
well, I'll start, and I think that my answer will probably be different from other people's, but I came into this through the field of cultural resource management, or private sector archaeology. And so one of the projects that led me to this is basically it's funded through cultural resource management work, which is under laws in the United States. If there is like federal funding for projects, then before that project takes place, you are required to have a survey of the property to check for resources. And so that's sort of private company funding that started the project, which has its own limitations. And then when I decided to get my master's degree, then a lot of that money came from grant funding. So it's kind of been a cobbling together of different grant sources and good old-fashioned capitalism, I guess.
and Patricia, how about your work down in Peru?
Funding is the basis of everything. And in this regard in particular, since we don't get much funding from the Peruvian government, we have been lucky that I have been able to gather a little bit from research grants at UC Santa Barbara, a little bit, but mostly one of my colleagues, Daniel Saucedo Segami, who is also at this institute, the Ribagüero Institute, and founder of this Japanese Presence in Peru research group, he has been able, he teaches in Japan, and he has been able to secure some funding through the Japanese government. So that's basically the core of our resources pool for the moment.
And Bill?
Oh, well, most of our funding obviously comes from, because it's run as a field school, it was coming from tuition dollars. But we also applied for JAX grants, the Japanese American Confinement Site Grant Program from the National Park Service, Department of Interior, to buy certain kinds of equipment like the total station and things in the past. And the other major support that we had from the National Park Service was through Cooperative Ecosystems Grant, and that covered part of a buyout for me to write reports, but we specific during look at different parts around over we had that. So what was left in the grant is being used now to gather this sort of oral history of the students. And so and I think they're going to continue that next year. So with the oral history part and ethnography, so I think it's going to be really interesting. But that's where most of our money is coming from, tuition dollars in the National Park Service.
I see. And Bob, is your project also coming from the field school or the students that you?
Yeah, well, it's funded by the tuition by the students, and I'm glad to say there's no surcharge on the students. So I often promote it as the best value for a field school in the world because it's local and students get themselves to and from the site every day. It takes them about 90 minutes, but they get themselves to and from. Interestingly, Capilano, where I am, is a small university, and it's a teaching focused university. So they're not set up, they don't have the infrastructure for any kind of research. And so it was really impossible for me to get any grants because the university didn't know how to deal with them. But that's just changed several months ago. And so now we can get all the big grants that are out there. And I had a meeting a few months ago with the grants person that came from, we got her from UBC, which is the biggest local university, and she's familiar with my work. And she said I'd be able to get any grants that I wanted, up to hundreds of thousands of dollars based on my record. And so now I'm contemplating whether I'm going to apply for more grants because at my university they won't allow buyouts of teaching, and so I teach 8 courses a year, which is like a pretty heavy workload. So to have to deal with all the grants on top of that, I'm just sort of weighing it. It's quite exciting for me to be able to be assured that I would get any money to continue my research. But on the other hand, we don't have graduate students, and we don't even have an archaeology major or an anthropology major. So it all falls on me. So it's exciting that now I could almost be assured of getting money if I wanted to continue this. But on the other hand, I don't know if I want all that extra work. I'm already working a lot. So there you go. All the stuff just came 20 years too late for me.
And I'll round out by saying that my work has largely been supported by the Japanese American Confinement Sites grants, like Bill, the JAX grant, as well as some anthropological fieldwork dissertation grants from the Wintergren Foundation. So we're coming up at the end of our hour, and one last question's coming in, and it'll be our lightning round question for everybody. And it's the question that I think Bob mentioned earlier that every archaeologist gets, which is most exciting discovery during your years of practicing archaeology. What is the most exciting thing you found? Lightning round. We'll start with you, Renae, because you're next to me on the screen.
All right, well, I'll try to make it quick. I think in relevance to our current conversation, one of the neatest artifacts that I found simply because of its history was a piece of a specific type of teapot that is a landscape teapot that came into fashion during the Meninge movement in Japan, and so in the 1920s and 30s. And it was a very small piece, like a couple inches large, and it was just a rim shard, but you could trace it back to an actual maker, a woman, Minagawa Matsu, who was well known for producing these types of pots in a specific region of Japan, and a whole cultural movement that went on with that just really, to me, opened up fascinating questions about why the person who owned that purchased it. Was it because it was a really great teapot, or was it because it was an international art symbol, or just one of those objects that so many different questions come out of.
Patricia, you're up next.
I think that for me, anything that that I have found so far that leads to questions of why did this person bring this particular object, like made 1,000 kilometers away, because it's like, okay, what is essential for you at that particular moment in your life? And for me, in terms of like, my mom was a dekasegi in the 90s in Japan. So she went to work in Japan for almost 20 years. I was, although for completely different experience, I was also uh, studying in the US for an extended period of time. It's like, okay, what are these objects telling us about like cultural shock, about like adapting to new places and all that kind of stuff. The experience of migration, really.
Great. And Bob?
Well, as I said before, like personally, my favorite artifact is, you know, that little shawl pin, but it's not very visually appealing. And, you know, when I go to public presentations, people don't really care about that. So then I can take other things that people are drawn to, like the ceramics or um, the bottles. But I probably, one of my favorite ones is a little piece of a camera. That's a Eastman Kodak camera, bullseye camera that we can date to 1916 or thereabouts that we found inside the bathhouse. So it makes for a good story. Like we haven't found the negatives yet and all that kind of stuff. But it's you know, for popular appeal, that sort of gets people's imagination going. I've also found some bottles with a little bit of liquid left in it, you know, with it still sealed. So I like that for public presentations. It's fascinating to people, and they all say, "Well, why don't you open it? Why don't you open it?" Mostly, I don't want to open it because it might not be alcohol or it might not be anything. It might just be dirty water. But so basically, when it comes to what's most fascinating, it depends on the context, right? When I'm talking to my colleagues, it's different than when I'm talking to the public. But you know, for my long career in archaeology, even before I started working in historic archaeology or with Nikkei sites, I've always got a kick out of finding villages, which is, you know, my latest find too. Because when I used to work for indigenous populations, and I go into areas where no archaeologist has been before, and I can find like villages. I get a kick out of that. That's like really important. When I did early in my career, when I worked in Egypt, it was interesting, but it was like, okay, well, like I'm like the 1,000th archaeologist here, and 150 years of people working in the same place. Whereas in British Columbia, I'm usually the only or the first archaeologist to go into an area. And I get a kick out of that. So it seems like almost everything I find seems to, you know, be pretty significant.
And Bill, round us out with your most fascinating find.
Okay, in this context, I think that when we found and uncovered just barely below the surface, where we could see the outlines of where wooden buildings were, and it was basically because of these rock gardens that were created during beautification of these areas. And so it was probably done by the incarcerees, but it was in the military portion of the camp. And so you could see basically sidewalks going at right angles, and you could see rings of rocks that were around trees and things like that. And it was just, and that's a really interesting thing because it connects to some of the watercolors that were done in 1942. And so they're beautiful, and it's just an amazing thing. But I'll step back a little bit. About 25 years ago, I used to work in Pakistan with the Indus Valley civilization, and we were excavating a mud brick platform, part of an old house. So it's about 4,500 years old. And we were able to excavate so we could see the drip line of where the roof was, where probably during the monsoon seasons, the rain was coming down. It was creating an eroded area in the brick platform. And then there were two sets of footprints between the wall and that drip line. And so one was an adult, and then one was a child. So I don't know if they're at the same time period or whatever, but it was kind of cool to see that as something that you could see and touch, that's a tangible experience. And that to me is what's really exciting about archaeology, even if it's a concrete mess hall platform that nobody's seen for 60 plus years. It's something the students can touch and feel and see that it's real. You know?
Oh, that's really interesting. And I'll end with saying that my similarly, one of the most fascinating things that I was able to find was a child's footprint in the side of a concrete pond, which just reminded me so much of what you see children do in new concrete everywhere, which is put their foot into it. And also something that I think is a really sweet marker of family and home that we often see too little of in these sites of forced removal and incarceration. Closing out, thank you very much, everyone, for your time and for all of you who joined us. And I'll just give a last 10 seconds to each of my panelists to tell us where can we find your work if people are interested in looking up what you're doing. Do you have a website? Is your contact information listed somewhere where they can get in touch for more information? Renae, starting out with you real quick.
All right, so you can find my contact information at the Asian American Comparative Collection website, which is online through the University of Idaho, and you can also find a link to the historical Japanese ceramic comparative collection that I mentioned earlier through that website. So search for the AACC at the University of Idaho.
Great. And Patricia?
Yeah, you can find my contact information in the anthropology department website at UC Santa Barbara. And I'm also on pretty much every social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
What's your handle?
On Twitter, which is like the one that I use the most, is Patty Chirinos in Twitter.
Great. Bob?
You can find my contact information at Capilano University in North Vancouver, British Columbia. Or you could just Google, Muckle Japanese archaeology, because there's been hundreds of articles written on my project over the last several months. Some of them good, some of them not, but you can find it there. And I have a book coming out on my project next year.
Oh, we're all looking forward to reading that. Bill?
You can go to the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Just do Google for William or Bill Belcher. It'll come up. Copies of the reports that I did for the Park Service are available at my page on researchgate.net. And we have a couple of articles coming out in SAA Archaeological Practice Journal, or Journal of Archaeological Practice. I don't know when that's coming out, but and then in Hawaii, or Society of Hawaiian Archaeology is an article on the POW platform. So, and that's the first time that's been published for 4 years. I'm pretty excited about that journal coming back.
Looking forward to adding that to my reading list too. And I'm your host, Koji Lau-Ozawa. You can type my name into Google, and I'm probably the only Lau-Ozawa that'll pop up beside my wife. You can find my information on the Stanford University website. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and looking forward to more conversations in the future. Thank you to Aaron and Kimiko, who are in the background helping facilitate this, and to Tadaima, a virtual pilgrimage, which is in its 9th and final week. It's incredible that we've hit 9 weeks here, and I'm looking forward to all the great content coming out this week and that opening ceremony next weekend. All right. Have a great afternoon and enjoy your Sunday, everybody.
Great. Thank you.